Good morning, everyone. Really appreciated being invited to talk about this. I have spoken about it many times, but it continues to evolve, and there's some changes that are very important that have come up that are relevant to neurology, but also some other fields in medicine. And it's something that I think a lot of people haven't learned about in prior training. So I want to give some perspective on it and put it in the context of evidence-based and lack of evidence base and legal considerations, ethical considerations. There's lots of aspects to it. But I do speak for Jazz Pharmaceuticals, which is the only FDA-approved form of cannabis therapy. And I did serve as the CMO for Compassionate Cultivation, which is one of the still existing dispensaries for a number of years. I'm no longer in that role today. So we're going to go over the history of the compassionate use program in Texas, which is now a decade old, and talk about the basics of cannabis and focusing especially on CBD treatment. But what's probably on everybody's mind when we talk about cannabis is really THC and how that plays a role in therapy. And that's especially important when you talk about the compassionate use program, because that is also THC therapy, whereas other forms of cannabis are more focused on CBD. It's a combination of both things, but how those two molecules play together is going to be a lot of the topic of what we discuss. We're going to talk about symptom-based therapy, and symptom-based because it's something that has very inadequate evidence base for how we utilize these therapies and treatment. Some of the things that we understand and that are a little bit more established in utilizing cannabis therapy. And then we're going to talk about some challenges that are still unanswered questions. So I looked for an updated map on the legal status of marijuana and cannabis programs across the country. And this is what I found from Rolling Stone magazine, very commonly cited medical journal. And so it's just interesting to see how this map has changed over time. And what stands out the most to me is the dark green states, which is legal use for recreational use in adults. And that, of course, famously started in Colorado and not far behind in California and along the West Coast. But now there are many states that have legal recreational use. And if you travel around the United States, you see that. But even in Texas, where it's definitely not legal for recreational use, cannabis is all around us. And I think that even if this is not something that you practice clinically, I think it's important to understand how that has occurred in our society and how we can understand it as practicing physicians. So Texas is a lighter green state. And so what makes the lighter green states different from the intermediate green states. So the intermediate green, the kind of Kelly green colors there, are cannabis programs without a lot of restriction on the THC content. And the lighter green is specifically low THC. So it's more restrictive, but it does have legal medicinal use. And every state has their own set of rules and guidelines about how they regulate cannabis use. So this is the journey of the medical cannabis story in Texas. And the first Compassionate Use Act was passed now 10 years ago in 2015. And the legend, and I believe it's a true story, is that the governor at the time was having a meeting with a family who was lobbying for passage of this. And the patient was an epilepsy patient, a child, who had a seizure in the office. And that was apparently a turning point that led to the passage of this act that otherwise might have been vetoed at the time. So interestingly, the very first and initially only indication for medical use of cannabis in Texas was epilepsy, and in fact, only refractory epilepsy. And that didn't change for a couple of years. When the first dispensaries were opened and licensed, which was almost 2 years after the act was initially passed, there were 3 licensed dispensaries, and those 3 dispensaries are still the only existing dispensaries, but that is set to change with the recent legislation in the past year. And it took just a month for that to really get going. So once the dispensaries were identified and licensed and opened, they opened the registry to have physicians licensed to or registered to prescribe cannabis for medical use. And then in February, the dispensaries started to actually dispense medication. So that was February of 2018. And then in 2019, in the legislation that met, the legislative bodies that met in 2019, the compassionate use program was expanded. So this was the first expansion. And the thing that changed the most in 2019 was the number of different diagnostic categories or patient diagnoses that could be eligible to participate in the compassionate use program. So this was highly sought after. There were a lot of different patient groups and interest groups, industry groups who wanted this to happen from the get-go, but only epilepsy was eligible initially, and that was expanded to include autism with the second go-round, and that was heavily influenced by patient and family lobbying, multiple sclerosis, spasticity, terminal cancer, but it had to be a terminal form of cancer. It couldn't just be something that was a treatable, manageable form of cancer. And then ALS was singled out as a neurodegenerative disorder, but there was actually a widespread approval for other neurodegenerative disorders. And eventually they came up with a very long list of pretty much anything that you can think of for neurodegenerative disorders. And that was the change in 2019 that had the biggest impact. Initially in 2017, there was a requirement that if a physician registered a patient and was going to prescribe medicine, a second physician had to approve it, which was a pretty onerous requirement. And it had to be someone who wasn't in your own practice. It couldn't be your next door neighbor down the hall in clinic. It had to be someone independent of you. So that was a big hurdle to jump through. That was removed in 2019. And then it also gave an opportunity for physicians to be secretive about their participation in the compassionate use program. And I think that this has become something that is less stigmatized and more open, but there are still, I think, providers who are willing to do this, but don't want to be necessarily pursued for this type of therapy. And so if you aren't published in the registry as a physician who is prescribing cannabis, you won't have as many patients coming to you and asking for cannabis specifically. And I think that was a very significant aspect of the change in the law in 2019 that maybe isn't as big a deal today as this has become a more widely accepted thing. So they also made it, and this was in response to a lot of feedback from prescribers, was they changed the definition of prescribe to mean writing something in the compassionate use registry. And this was in response to physician prescribers who felt that they were at risk because this is still a Schedule I substance and from the FDA's standpoint. And a lot of prescribers were very uncomfortable with the idea of writing a prescription for something that was federally illegal. And so the legislature thought perhaps that if they changed the definition to not being a prescription, they could work around that and get some people more comfortable with the idea of participating. The other thing that had a very big impact on what was available for treatment in Texas was that they changed the required minimum. So originally there had to be a 100 milligram per milliliter concentration of CBD in the product that was given out from the dispensary. And that was changed in 2019 so that you could give less and less and less CBD. And in fact, if you read the letter of the law, it doesn't specify that it has to be greater than 0, which means that you can make things that have nothing but THC. And that was a very significant change that I'm not entirely convinced that the non-medical law writers were aware of, that they were kind of opening the door to this, because I was pretty shocked when that occurred. But it did occur, and that's been true since 2019, that there have been compounds available from the dispensaries that have only THC and no CBD whatsoever. So this is kind of onward and upward through the journey here. In 2021, there was a second expansion, and that expanded to additional diagnoses, most notably PTSD. So PTSD rapidly became the most common reason that anybody received a prescription for cannabis therapy in the state of Texas. It just inundated the demand for the dispensary, and the production and utilization of the compassionate use program went up quite a bit. And they also not quite doubled. It went from 0.3% to 0.5%, what the concentration of THC was that was allowed. That changed in 2021. And then in 2023, there was a legislative session, but nothing changed in the compassionate use program. There's a lot of conversation, a lot of expectation that something would change, but nothing changed. This year, a lot of things changed. So this is what happened in 2021, PTSD being the most significant change. They also specified that cancer didn't need to be a terminal cancer. Any form of cancer would qualify, which didn't have as much of an impact because generally speaking, it was only patients who had very serious forms of cancer that were utilized in the compassionate use program. Chronic pain had a close call for approval in 2021, but lost. And our lieutenant governor was the primary barrier to that at the time. He was not interested in expanding to include chronic pain. That did not happen in 2021, but it happened in 2025. So that is now a diagnosis that is allowed for compassionate use prescription. And then, as I mentioned, they increased the THC concentration to 1%. And because of that, you can now have prescriptions that do not include CBD. So in 2025, just in the last legislative session, chronic pain as a diagnosis is now allowed for compassionate use participation. And the definition that they chose for chronic pain was 90 days, which is a pretty low bar. And so if someone comes in and it also doesn't specify what the pain needs to be, or what the underlying etiology of the pain needs to be. It's a very, very broad diagnosis. So I think this is a very big jump compared to 2021 when this didn't make it at all. And now it's really a very broad category. So this has just recently been enacted. It was passed several months ago when the legislative session was in full force, but it didn't take effect until September, which is just a few weeks ago. The other diagnoses that they included were traumatic brain injury, including chronic traumatic encephalopathy specifically, and then inflammatory bowel disease, which I'll talk a little bit about. We actually have a little bit of evidence base for treatment of inflammatory bowel disease with cannabis, and then also broadened any terminal illness, any patient in hospice care, which is primarily cancer, but not necessarily exclusively cancer. A lot of these conditions were already included in the previous range of diagnoses that were allowed for participation. So they also changed the definition of maximum THC, and this was kind of a welcome thing to me. They have maxed it per dose at 10 milligrams. And a lot of the dosing regulation, it's kind of interesting when you read this as a physician, because there are politicians and a lot of legal professionals who make the rules about this. But if you think about it, if you've got a bottle with THC in it and the maximum dose is 10 milligrams and you take 2 doses, you're taking 20 milligrams. So it's not really any different, but I think the legislators became uncomfortable with the idea that there were gummies out there with 20 milligrams of THC per bite, because was available for prescription. It was widely utilized in patients who have post-traumatic stress disorder. So those are no longer for sale. You can't prescribe them anymore, but you can get 10 milligram gummies and take 2, which isn't really very different in my view. But that's how the rules have changed this year. This was also something that took a lot of conversation, is that they legalized inhaled delivery. These are not yet available for prescription, but they are going to be available soon. The reason that they're not out there yet is because the legislation did not specify what the inhaled forms could be. What this will mostly be is vapes. And I have a lot of personal feelings about this idea in general, but there will be vapes and there will probably be MDIs, meter dose inhalers of cannabis coming out. Other forms that are available already are suppository forms and topicals. This is useful for patients who can't tolerate enteral prescriptions or aren't taking anything by mouth anymore. And so those things are already available, but the inhaled forms are just starting to come out. The other thing that happened that was very important logistically for the dispensaries themselves is that originally the requirement was that all of the product had to be housed within the dispensary 100% of the time. And yet they were also required to courier and deliver every single product to each individual patient throughout the entire state. And all three of these dispensaries had one location in the central Texas area, right around Austin. So you had to go from Austin to the far reaches of Texas in every direction in any 24-hour period, and in theory, bring it back again, which is really not an attainable goal. It was never an attainable goal. And as the production and utilization of compassionate use has increased, it really made it unsustainable for the dispensary. So this was a big deal for just the business of carrying this out and being able to deliver service. That's now, I think it got enacted very quickly because the dispensaries were so anxious to have this opportunity, and they've been working on getting it ready for a long time. So we still have 3 licensed dispensaries today. Compassionate Cultivation is the one that I formerly was working with, and that that was started by a group of actually Texan businessmen. Fluent and Good Blend are both companies that were Florida companies and had a strong presence in the Florida cannabis world before they came to Texas. Fluent really doesn't have very much business despite being open since the original licensing, but they are going to open 9 new dispensaries in theory by the end of this year, and then license 3 more sometime in the following 4 months. So this is going to expand quite a bit. I mentioned that PTSD had become the most common diagnosis. I think chronic pain will compete with that very quickly. And over 350 physicians are now listed in CURT. I actually went and counted because I couldn't find a number. And that's just the ones that are publicly listed. So there are certainly more than that. And this includes a lot of physicians who basically came to Texas and opened up shop in order to participate in compassionate use, because there are lots of prescribers out there who are in the business of doing cannabis for a living. From a patient perspective, one of the consequences of the expansion of compassionate use program is that the cost has come down a lot. It was extremely, extremely expensive and not very sustainable for long-term utilization originally, because it was just the price point was very, very high. And part of the reason that it came down is because originally everything had to be grown in-house, had to grow the plants and produce the product in-house. And in 2021, they changed it, and only the THC portion had to be grown in-house, and they could source CBD, including from hemp products, other places. Not to get too deeply into that, but it made a big difference in the price, because the majority of what they have to grow or have to do to have to kind of have access to make the products is CBD, and that's expensive if you have to grow it yourself, but it's really inexpensive if you can source it from other places, which means that we no longer have a product that is being completely controlled within the dispensary, growing from seed to product as it was originally. So it just kind of changed the nature of that, but it also made it very much easier for the dispensaries to meet the growing demand. So this is what the list of eligible diagnoses looks like today. The list on the right-hand side that's in green are the current additions from the 2025 expansion. So I'm going to get into a little bit of the medicine of cannabis science. So as you all probably know, this is what a flowering cannabis plant looks like. And these are flowering buds. That is where the rich part of the CBD and the THC comes from. There's a very, very long-standing tradition of utilizing cannabis for medicine. And like many of our medications, it comes from a plant. And my favorite thing when people tell me that they want cannabis is they say, well, it's natural, and that means it's going to be better for me, and I want a natural therapy. And I say, it's a drug. It has side effects. It's not something you're supposed to eat, and it has consequences. Natural has nothing to do with it. Digoxin is natural too. Cyanide is natural. Lots of things are natural. They can kill you. It kind of gets under my skin. But anyway, in case you can't tell, there are lots and lots and lots of other chemicals in cannabis. And this is a big deal because people who read about this and learn about it before they come in asking for treatment with cannabis have a biased knowledge about what all those chemicals are and what they do. But there are cannabinoids and there are terpenes that come from cannabis plants. We'll talk a little bit about terpenes at the end. But the two most relevant compounds are CBD, which is cannabidiol, and THC, which is tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the part that gets you high. So CBD has actually been recognized as a compound for over 20 years longer than THC, which was discovered later. So what is hemp? Hemp also is a cannabis plant. They're both cannabis plants. The definition of hemp is that the concentration of THC that comes out of that plant is lower. It's below 0.3%, okay? And 0.3% is the cutoff. So years ago, the Farm Bill in 2018, which happens to coincide with when the compassionate use program started in Texas, that legalized the trade of hemp, the transportation of hemp, and the utilization of hemp. So when you see CBD for sale at the local gas station, that's coming from hemp. It's low concentration THC, and it's completely unregulated by the government. It doesn't always have what it says it has on the bottle. In fact, we know that it usually doesn't have what it says it has on the bottle, but it's inexpensive, and it is potentially contaminated by a lot of other things. It's not tested, and it's not very potent. So people don't usually get any kind of intoxicating effect from it. They probably aren't getting much of a medicinal benefit from it either. So medical cannabis is anything that's higher than a 0.3% concentration of THC, and sometimes very much higher than a 0.3% concentration of THC, but it comes from a cannabis plant as well. And in our state, it is heavily regulated by the Department of Public Safety, and it is subject to strict testing protocols. Each individual dispensary does testing on each and every batch. And if you want to go and look up what your batch tested at, you can see it online. Marijuana, on the other hand, is the federally illegal substance. The THC content by comparison is 15 to 20%. It is unregulated and untested, and you don't really know where it came from. It can be contaminated by lots of other things. It can be cut with dangerous drugs, but it also can contain a lot of heavy metals and pesticides. Cannabis as a plant is a very kind of hungry plant. It's used to transition fields and grow out a lot of contaminants in the soil, and it will take those chemicals right up into the plant out in areas where hemp is grown. So it can be a very dirty substance, basically. So marijuana still is Schedule 1. There's been a lot of speculation that might be downgraded in the near future, but it has not happened yet. So why does this have relevance to us as physicians? So there is an endocannabinoid system in all of our bodies, similar to opioid receptors that occur naturally. There are two different receptors, CB1 and CB2, that are targets for phytocannabinoids that come from cannabis plants, or synthetic cannabinoids, of which there are several that are manufactured. And these are the mechanisms by which a lot of cannabis has an effect. Now, interestingly, CBD does not bind to these receptors. CBD has cellular effects, but not through these receptor types. THC does bind to these receptors and the intoxicating effect of THC is translated by these receptors. So there's lots of things that the cannabinoid system has an impact on, which is why there are so many different ways that a cannabis therapy can have an impact on various symptoms that people experience. We understand some of that. A lot of what we understand about cannabinoids and cannabis therapy comes from animal studies. Very little of it comes from human studies, and virtually none of it is from controlled human studies. But this is the best evidence we have. This is treatment of epilepsy from the FDA-approved form of cannabis therapy, which is cannabidiol or Epidiolex. It is only CBD. There is no THC in Epidiolex. But if you have a patient who's taking cannabidiol and you test them with a tox screen, they will come up positive for THC because the chemical compound of CBD and THC is so similar to each other that the toxicology screen can't tell the difference. And it will pop positive as a positive THC exposure, even if they aren't taking any THC at all. This was FDA approved in 2018, but not actually on the market until about 2019. So there was about a year window when you could get dispensary cannabis in Texas before you could prescribe Epidiolex, which is going to be relevant for a couple of slides I'm going to show you soon. 2 years later, there was a third indication added to the list, which is tuberous sclerosis. And these are the current 3 indications still today for use of Epidiolex in epilepsy. And what's really, really helpful is this is what kind of legitimizes cannabis therapy for anything, because this is the only significant double-blind placebo-controlled evidence that we have in the United States. And I'll talk a little bit about what's available in Europe for multiple sclerosis, because that's the other form of cannabis that is approved by another body, but that didn't happen in the US. So Epidiolex can be effective in monotherapy. I have several patients who take this and have full control of seizures on Epidiolex alone, but in most cases, it's used as adjunctive therapy in significantly refractory epilepsy. But the best part of using cannabis therapy is that side effect profile is really benign. People tolerate this medicine well. It has a lot to do with what other medicines they take in terms of what you see for side effects. And importantly, combination with clobazam is pretty essential for getting the full benefit of cannabidiol therapy. Interestingly, in Europe, which lagged behind the approval in the United States by several years, but it's approved in Europe as a combination therapy. And so if you prescribe Epidiolex or cannabidiol in Europe, it is required that there is co-therapy with clobazam, which is probably advantageous for patients because it took a while for us to really understand that as prescribers in the United States, and you just get much better outcomes. Not every single patient needs that, but if you start that from the beginning of how you utilize cannabidiol for treatment of epilepsy, you get a better response to that. So it's a combination therapy that has really important implications for efficacy. So this is from the original approval trials for Lennox-Gastaut, looking at the primary endpoint, which was drop seizures. And there was a 39% responder rate of greater than 50% seizure reduction at the 20 milligram per kilogram goal dose of cannabidiol. There was a 30% responder rate in the 10 milligrams per kilogram. So that's pretty close, those two. And that compared to placebo. Now, placebo response was pretty high. It was 14%. And for a patient, drop seizures being something that's a very obvious thing that's pretty easy to count, it's remarkable how high the placebo response rate was. Getting better response than that does occur. 25% of patients had a 75% or greater response, and about 5% of the high dose group were seizure free during the course of the maintenance phase, which was 12 weeks long. So this was the original data that brought Epidiolex to use. And this is a series that I put together myself. This is looking at the patients that I was treating with dispensary CBD and THC combination therapy before Epidiolex was available. And interestingly, in my little pie chart here, looking at the green colors, my number between 90% reduction and 50 to 90% comes to 32% of my group had greater than 50% response rate, which is really interesting. And this is not Lennox-Gastaut specific. It's just patients that I happen to put on therapy. This is not, high level science. This was not electronic seizure diaries and all of this, but it was an IRB approved review of my cohort. And patients like this therapy. They tolerate it well. Of course, they have extremely high expectations. The usual request from patients who come in asking for cannabidiol or cannabis therapy for their epilepsy, they say, okay, I want that medicine because it's going to stop all of my seizures and I won't have any side effects. And I say, well, we can try that therapy, but let's talk about your expectations because that's not how this usually works. But there are some nice things that come along with improved seizure control. And I think because this is such a unique medicine for mechanism of action, some patients really get significant seizure benefit. And because of that, can have a lot of other symptoms improve. Common side effects are somnolence and sometimes sleep disruption and insomnia, which is, I think, under recognized in some of the approval studies, diarrhea or loose stools, GI upset. These are pretty common. Sometimes it can aggravate behavior, which most of our seizure medicines have the capacity to do. So this was a natural experiment that happened by accident because there was a year between when the dispensaries were opened and I could give people the cannabis that they were dying to try and when Epidiolex was available for prescription. So I had patients who were taking cannabis for a year for their epilepsy. And then a lot of them, if they had the right kind of epilepsy, if they had Lennox-Gastaut or Dravet syndrome, this was before TS was approved, they could switch to Epidiolex. So this was the group of my patients, and there were 75 patients who qualified to switch to Epidiolex. And about a third of them switched to Epidiolex and didn't look back. And they were really happy not to have to pay for it themselves anymore because now it was covered by insurance. 43% of patients had switched to Epidiolex and it worked, but their seizures weren't as good. And they added back some dispensary cannabis and that seemed to help. So this was a really interesting group to me because we have essentially no data that really looks at this in a controlled and useful way, certainly not with any kind of placebo control or any kind of way to really see, are people seeing what they want to see, or is this a real phenomenon? But I had a lot of patients where it seemed very clear that their seizures worsened when they stopped the THC component. I even had a few patients who said, you know what, I don't like this medicine as much. We want to just go back to the dispensary. I'll pay for it. I don't need the insurance company to pay for it, which isn't so hard to do if your child weighs 10 kilograms. But if you're a 100-kilogram adult, that's not a sustainable choice. But I did have patients who chose to do that. I had a small group of patients who came off cannabis therapy. People like this, they're seeking it, they have high expectations. And a lot of that is self-fulfilling prophecy, especially if they get a good initial response to treatment. So originally, the only thing available through dispensaries was a 20-to-1 ratio, which fit the 0.5% THC concentration and the 100 milligrams per milliliter requirement that was originally required. But then when they loosened up and changed the concentrations, it was possible, as I said, to give less CBD, and you could even have exclusively THC. And that gives you a 0-to-1 ratio. Side effects, we talked about a little bit, some GI side effects, fatigue and somnolence being common, vomiting or psychosis is kind of the feared side effect. I personally have never seen a patient get a psychotic reaction. I've seen aggression at times. But in our clinic, we now have a nurse practitioner who runs a cannabis clinic, and that's all that she sees in our practice, but most of the partners that I work with are registered for compassionate use and do some degree of cannabis therapy. I'm past time, so I'm going to just zoom through this a few things. So there's just a very, very little known about how we should manage these different ratios. High CBD therapy is very much more expensive because there's just more medicine in the bottle, but that is the kind of treatment that we understand the best because that's what we use for epilepsy is high CBD. But if you're targeting pain, if you're targeting behavioral regulation like in autism, and if you're targeting spasticity, the low CBD forms seem to work much better without therapy standing behind it. So there are now lots and lots and lots more publications, but not very high quality, like scientific data at the level that we want to have. This is, for example, still the most cited study on autism, which comes from Israel, and it is nothing but an observational study of 53 patients, and that's as good as it gets for autism. And this is from the multiple sclerosis community. So there's a nasal spray that's THC, high THC, low CBD, that's available in Europe for spasticity treatment in multiple sclerosis. There was a big trial, multi-center trial, that came to the United States looking at this, and it was very disappointing because they did not meet initial endpoint goals, and the study was terminated. And so this was not approved in the United States, and probably will not be revisited. So there was a treatment protocol brought out by the AAN way back in 2014 about multiple sclerosis. This has not been updated. Multiple sclerosis as a diagnosis is widely accepting of the use of cannabis, and the majority of people with a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis are self-medicating with cannabis, actually, even though there's not much standing behind it. Similarly, with PTSD, there has only been one randomized controlled trial, and there's some suggestion of improved kind of quality of life and decreased overall symptoms, but it's pretty weak therapy. Weak efficacy evidence. Inflammatory bowel disease, this is the randomized controlled trial that has been brought up, and this is what led to the addition of this diagnosis to compassionate use program. But the power of that evidence has been rated only as low to moderate. It has been suggested that it can give some measurable impact on clinical disease, but does not induce remission and does not measurably decrease inflammation. Quality of life measures were shown to be improved, statistically speaking, in that study. They also had more adverse effects compared to placebo, not surprisingly. So there's lots of other things that we can talk about. This has been touted as a treatment for cancer, but it's well known that this is not proven at all to be beneficial for treatment of cancer itself. It probably has a role in mitigating some of the side effects we see with chemotherapy, particularly nausea and vomiting. And so there's some support for that. And the American College of Oncology, they kind of weakly support the idea of utilizing cannabis to mitigate this adverse effects, but it's not with the same level of certainty that we have from epilepsy trials, for example. So this can still be challenging in institutions. This has gotten better over time. For years, even Epidiolex, which is FDA approved, would sometimes not be administered in hospitals, which was astounding to me, but that's gotten better. Administration of dispensary medication has been challenging with home health nursing, with school nurses, but even though the Texas Board of Nursing actually put out a statement supporting the fact that patients should have access to this and that nurses should be allowed to provide it. A lot of hospitals have policies against that. Likewise, school boards have been slow to come around. This has improved considerably, and our students in public schools now have better access to their therapy because there are some published guidelines from the school systems. So a little bit about terpenes. Terpenes are what make plants smell the way they smell, mostly good, sometimes not as good. But this is a lot of different kinds of chemicals that are part of a cannabis plant. When you hear about whole spectrum cannabis, this is what they're talking about, is having terpenes mixed in, which the internet says is very, very important for how cannabis works. There's no evidence to support that, but there's also no evidence to prove that that's not true. So just to look at all of the still unknown questions that we have questions for, but